Our faith asks us to believe some pretty amazing things. We're asked to believe that 2,000 years ago, God became a human being and dwelt among us. A God who is so holy that our Jewish faith ancestors would not even say his name, humbled himself and became human. On top of this, we're asked to believe that the flesh God assumed was that of a Palestinian peasant from Nazareth. Even Nathanael, the disciple who is referred to as Bartholomew in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, said upon receiving his call to be a disciple of the Nazarene, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" And we're asked to believe that this peasant from Nazareth turned water into wine, healed the sick, raised the dead, and taught some radical and amazing things about God and God's love for us. His life and teaching so threatened humanity's status quo that he was betrayed by his own friends and brutally executed at the hands of the Roman government. And we're further asked to believe that the death of this peasant from the backwaters of Israel 2,000 years ago not only resulted in his resurrection, but we're asked to believe that his death and resurrection have salvific effect on our lives today. At this time of year, when we come together in joyful celebration, when we sing glorious hymns that tell of the passion and resurrection, belief in the amazing claims of our faith is not too difficult. Even the weather and the spring bloom seem to shout out to our northern hemisphere that he is risen. However, we do not live most of our lives in Eastertide. In fact, our day-to-day lives are much more ordinary, and sometimes our lives look and feel much more like Holy Week. Often the places where our faith is most tested and where our doubts seem to outweigh even our Easter hope come when we find ourselves in the midst of our own Gethsemanes. I noticed this most acutely when I was a summer chaplain intern at Erlanger Hospital in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Several of our patients were from faith traditions in which the expression of any kind of doubt was tantamount to apostasy. And on several occasions, we encountered patients riddled with guilt and fear because they were having serious doubts about a life beyond this one. In a few instances, those patients expressing the doubts were clergy, individuals who had stood in pulpits and behind altars for most of their lives proclaiming the resurrection. But when in the midst of their own Gethsemane experience, they were far less sure of their faith and very sure of their anxiety and doubt. But not all Gethsemanes that I witnessed as a chaplain were occasioned by the end of a patient's life. In fact, I would say most of them weren't. Our Gethsemanes manifest themselves in many ways. Some of us experience Gethsemane in the wake of ended relationships. Some of us find ourselves in Gethsemanes created by financial stresses, or job losses, or even job stresses. Others of us are innocently dragged to our Gethsemanes through the abuse at the hands of another. For all our Gethsemanes, for the places in our lives where our doubts and fears outweigh our faith, where all of our natural senses see and feel only death and destruction, today's lesson from John's Gospel is indeed good news. In this lesson, we learn that doubt is not the opposite of faith, but rather honest doubt is an occasion to encounter intimately the risen Christ. Doubting Thomas was in Gethsemane. His friend had been brutally executed. His own life was now in danger, and Thomas's messianic hopes were crushed and buried with Jesus. I am sure that he was thinking that even God had abandoned him for his blasphemous belief that a peasant from Nazareth who was rumored to have questionable parentage could be the Messiah. Thomas had to be in utter despair and bewilderment. Anyone in his situation would have the same doubts. Doubts of self, doubts of faith, doubts about the future. And what I so admire about Thomas is that his doubts are honest. He doesn't just play along with the other disciples. He very honestly confesses his doubt and says, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my fingers in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." And his honest confession is met with an intimate encounter with the risen Jesus. Because of Thomas's honesty about his doubt and the subsequent encounter with Jesus, we are privileged to read a very graphic, intimate account of the gospel good news, wherein the incarnation is joined to the resurrection, and Thomas's doubts are transformed into the strongest statement of faith found in the Gospel of John, "My Lord and my God." Our doubts not being the opposite of faith is not the only good news given to us by Thomas's encounter with the risen Jesus. In this lesson, we have a poignant reminder that the resurrected flesh that ascended into the Trinity was not flesh unblemished by human experience. It was wounded flesh, flesh that had experienced loneliness, rejection, despair, flesh that had experienced times of doubt and anxiety so profound that it manifested itself in sweat drops of blood. Flesh that was abused and scarred by torture, and flesh that had even experienced that which we fear the most, death itself. That same flesh ascended into the Trinity and is there interceding, bearing witness to the human condition. So when we feel discouraged and rejected, when we are lonely and in despair, when we find ourselves in our own Gethsemanes and our anxious fears are producing far more doubt than faith, remember this: there is a heart of flesh beating in the very midst of the Trinity, interceding on our behalf. And when we are honest about our doubts with ourselves, with each other, and with God, we invite into our Gethsemanes that very Spirit which St. Paul tells us intercedes for us with sighs too deep for words. And when the power of the resurrection meets us in our Gethsemanes, our doubts will give way to our faith confession, "My Lord and my God." Amen.
Amen.